Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Alana. I'm an adult and seniors programmer with the Brantford Library. We're happy to be joined today by Garth for our presentation, which is brought to you by the Seniors at BPL Committee. So I'd like to thank Keith, Lorraine, and Catherine for all their help with the seniors programming during this pandemic. I know a lot of things have changed during this time, so all your help and advice are very appreciated. So for the presentation, if you have any questions, please type it into the Q&A section. That's at the bottom of your screen, and Garth will answer them at the end of the presentation. So I'll turn it over to him now. Garth is the owner and founder of the Grand River Rafting Company. This is an outdoor education company specialized in using rafts as floating classrooms, teaching on Indigenous knowledge, fish and wildlife, survival skills, and medicinal and edible plants. With the Brantford Public Library, we're glad to welcome Garth. Go ahead, Garth.
Does that mean the floor is mine now?
The floor is all yours.
What you guys missed is she skipped saying the word Attawandarons. Very clever.
I was afraid to mess it
up. Yes, everyone, my name is Garth. I'm actually a professional forester as well. I've always had a passion with Indigenous nations and accidentally stumbled upon the Attawandaron and started hearing myths and stories about them. And it's a very little known people and actually an amazing people. So what I'm going to try to do today is just make it come alive for everyone. And away we go. So let me find my share screen. And we'll pick this. Share. We'll make this a little bigger. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. The Attawandarons, so often, if you've ever gone to the cultural centers with the Six Nations, they describe the Attawandarons as a peaceful people, non-aggressive. And they were called neutral because they maintained a neutral stance. And the history often says that locally is that the Attawandarons died due to epidemics and being hunted down. And the last hangout where they were surviving were the caves in a lower gorge. The problem with that is there actually aren't caves at a lower gorge. So let's flip over and make this thing move a bit. Whoops. For some reason it's gone too far. Yes, sorry, we'll get you there. The Attawandaron territory is basically in what was called, I call it the Garden of Eden. It's in what we call a banana climate area. And you need to understand that back then, a lot of the areas north of here had extreme heavy snowfall, also extreme heavy temperature changes. Down here, the temperatures were much more moderate. The soil was much more fertile. This was what's called Carolinian forest, which has the largest variety of plants and trees in all of Canada. Also, because of that, the most abundant wildlife and birds, and also the most abundant fish. So this was actually a breadbasket area. And so we call them the keepers of the Southern Ontario, where the Attawandarons, the French nicknamed them the Neutrals. This kind of gives you a layout of the Attawandaron territory. So what you're going to see is their key village areas are circled in that red on the map there. And what they had surrounding them was alliances and what we're going to call buffer protection. So their alliances were with the Petchin, the Huron, the Windrow, the Erie, and the Anadaste. And you'll also see that over towards the people of the Fire, which is the Attawandaron, they have a big orange buffer area, so they aren't easily accessible from that area for traveling forces, okay? So as I've said, their territories were following the Carolinian forest. Their populated towns were in alliance-safe places. They used buffers. They were farmers, and this is what created the famous, what we call the Brantford Plains, going from Brantford down beyond London, Ontario. It was a huge oak savanna, and that came due to agricultural farming practices, okay? If you want to get a feel for the wildlife of the area, you really want to take a look at Lady Simcoe's diaries of 1790. Really gives you a feel for the abundance of wildlife in this area. As I said, the Attawandarons, they had key alliances, so they were allied with the 4 Huron nations. They were allied with the Erie, the Petchin. The Petchin are an amazing people. They were the oldest Iroquois tongue that we know of in the area here. There was also the Windrow, and then last of all, they did a later alliance with the Anadaste or Susquehannock. All of these nations are what we call people of the Longhouse. They're of the Iroquoian dialect. And so that goes back, you can see them listed there, the Quechan, the Huron, Attawandaron. I want to point out the bottom line, the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk. They were located that way. So the Seneca were the keepers of the western door, the Mohawks were the keepers of the eastern door. And if you want to remember how they were aligned, the word is Skoon. So it goes Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga in the middle, then Oneida, then Mohawk. So that's just an acronym which kind of help you remember how they were laid out. Some people call the Attawandarons the Chonatan, which means people of the deer. When they were studying Attawandaron sites, they found huge piles of deer bones. And a theory came up that the Attawandarons were actually, because of that huge number of deer debris, let's call it that way, they thought that they were raising herds of deer. That theory cannot be possible. I'm going to give you 3 reasons. First of all, to keep deer in, as you know, you'd have to build a huge fence system. That's the first thing you need. The next thing you need to understand is you'd have to be collecting a lot of fodder and food to keep them alive, especially during the winter period. And you need to understand that among all the First Nations of that time, winter survival was so critical. They were busy storing up food to stay alive themselves, let alone looking after deer. But the most amazing point is the fact that if the Jesuit priests had come across people keeping deers, believe me, it would have been in their diaries. There's absolutely nothing mentioning anything like this. The key protein sources for the Attawandarons, number 1 was fish. That's almost for all of the nations. Then secondly, it was deer, as we've talked. Squirrel was a critical one. And a real important one in the early spring was raccoons. So those were the 4 sources of protein that they often depended upon. Also, as you know, we will call these people farming people. They were sedentary people in a way. They traded with corn, squash, bean. They also grew tobacco. Their fields were absolutely huge. Actually came across a Jesuit comment in a diary where he talks about getting lost in the cornfields. So that gives you an idea of how big these cornfields can be. Back then, the average cornfield would maybe produce about 10 to 12 bushels to the acre, where today you're seeing over 100 bushels to the acre. I want to tell a little story about corn because corn is a very important factor. When the Europeans came here, they were absolutely amazed at how the First Nations were sustaining themselves on corn. And I'm talking living 5, 6, 7 days on a straight corn diet. So they're all excited about how multiple this plant, how it multiplied itself. So when they took this to Europe and started feeding a steady diet of corn, what happened was people got niacin deficiency and actually went crazy. So the thought was, oh, stupid First Nations, they didn't know what they're talking about. The problem was it was actually stupid Europeans. The secret to digesting corn is, as all of you know, when you eat corn on the cob, you eat it and you poop it back out the other end. It looks like it hasn't done anything. So the secret is if you mix lye, wood lye, like from sugar maple, oak, hickory, in with the corn and make it into a soft mash, the lye makes protein accessible to your body and you then can absorb the energy from the corn. But without the wood lye ash in there, the corn is totally undigestible and you would definitely get niacin deficiency. Another thing that the Attawandarons or neutral are really famous for, they were considered the best of the best when it came to flint knocking. A lot of people think that the reason they had such powerful control was because of the chert beds. But if you actually study the movement of flint across Ontario and North America, the chert beds in Ontario were really low grade, low quality. The better stuff came from the United States area and Ohio, etc. These are actually some Attawandaron artifacts. The one that you're going to see on the far left is actually a gouge made totally out of stone. The white one is actually a weight for a fishing net. And the big one you see on the map is actually an adze or an axe head. That axe head would have probably taken over 40 weeks to peck, sorry, not 40 weeks, but 40 days to peck and make that axe head the way we're seeing. This is just some more artifacts found. You can see a little clay head. This is actually found along the mouth of Whiteman's Creek at the Grand River. But the one thing I want to show you that a lot of people have not seen, it's on your right-hand corner, it's curved like a moon, is a banner stone. Banner stones, there's some debate about that. They were either for spiritual purposes, but a lot of people think they were actually weights used on a weapon called the at-addle. I'll show you an at-addle. So the at-addle, as you can see, has an extension coming off from the arm and then a long spear. The weight would actually be on the short extension arm. These at-addles were actually used before the bow and arrow. To give you an idea of how powerful these are, the shafts would be about a ½ inch in diameter. And when you throw these things, they can go up to 100 miles an hour. They can actually go through a moose. So that gives you the idea of the power of the at-addle. I want to talk about the quirks of the Attawandarons. First of all, when the Jesuits came across these people, one of the comments they make is these are one of the biggest bone people they have ever seen. Their stature is much more noticeable than all the other nations that the Jesuits have come across. The other thing that was very different about them, they were a totally naked people. And one of the comments in one of the Jesuit diaries is that they were very immune to cold. Cold didn't seem to bother them. And their bodies were covered with tattoos. The tattoos were actually done in certain patterns. The purpose was to drive off evil spirits from the body. And it was done by inserting charcoal into the skin. You'll actually see that among a lot of the Haudenosaunee people as well. Another thing that really caught the attention of the Jesuits is that among the children, actually among that entire population, excuse me, I'll take a drink here. Among the entire population, there was a total lack of body deformities. Often among many First Nations, there was clubfoot people, or people that were hunchbacked. There were often people that were blind or visibility out of one eye. And there was none of that among the Attawandarons. And it may have a lot to do with the fact that they lived in the food basket of Ontario. Often common among many tribes was insanity. If you were insane, you were often sacred. And you were allowed to do whatever you wanted if you had an insanity problem. And one of the Jesuits actually makes a comment where he thinks people are faking it to be insane, so they get to do whatever they want. The Attawandarons were extremely superstitious. If you were an Attawandaron with curly hair, you would be killed. Curly hair was not acceptable among men. They had a very interesting hunting technique. They would actually build these great big wooden corrals with a funnel and drive all the wildlife into the funnel, and they killed everything. And the reason they killed everything, they had this fear that if something escaped, it would go back and warn everybody else about their hunting technique. So they actually were not conservationists at all. They just slaughtered everything. If you were an enemy, the best spot to be among Attawandarons, was in their longhouse. The rule was in the longhouse that enemies would be left alone and unharmed. And you'll actually see the Jesuit priests, I think they spent 2 or 3 weeks in a longhouse waiting for a decision from the key chieftain of whether they would be acceptable among the Attawandaron nations. Science absolutely fascinated these people. They were amazed at that, but they had no tolerance for religion. The Jesuit priests made no inroads whatsoever with these people. They also had a real fascination with the dead. If you were to die, one of the things is called placing the spirit. They would take the dead person, and the shaman would reach inside the dead person and supposedly pull out the spirit of that person and then place it in a new upcoming warrior. And that was the transfer of the name and the identity to that upcoming warrior. If you were to die, they are one of the few people I come across where they would keep the body in the longhouse, as we're seeing one here, as long as possible, almost to the point where the bodies were falling apart. You just wonder about the smell or what they did with the smell. It doesn't say. Once the body was in that state, they actually would take it out, put it on like a wooden frame, very similar to the Sioux, and leave the body exposed to nature and let nature clean off all the bones in that. Then they would collect the bones, bring them back in, keep them in a leather bag, and continue to mourn. They used to say that the Attawandarons were doing burials every 3 to 4 years, but they've also uncovered some graves in the Niagara area that say that they may have been very well doing a yearly grand burial service for all the people of that community. So that's a little bit about that. They had an absolute love for gambling. I came across one piece where an entire group of Attawandarons came back naked from the village. And by naked, I mean with none of their weapons or everything. They were all lost in gambling. Often in Ontario, we talk about drinking beer festivals. For them, eating was a festival. And they would almost eat to the point that they were so bloated, they could not move. So that was their celebration style. What really sets the Attawandarons apart is the fact that they were a nation that had almost like a king and a queen. They weren't husband and wife. They were actually two separate identities in control positions within the Attawandaron nation. The queen, the last queen recorded, you can just see her name there. I'm not going to try to pronounce it. She lived down along the Niagara River area. And the king that we came across actually lived somewhere in the Hamilton area. But they were the two residing powers with final say among the Attawandaron nation. The Attawandarons were very eloquent speakers. You'll often see that said. And one of the things they really understood was the power of having alliances to keep peace. They were amazing, skilled at creating alliances with the nations around them. Finally, if you were looking for a guide, the Attawandaron were considered the best of the best when it came to guiding. One of the things that the Attawandarons were absolutely horrible at was paddling on the rivers. You'll see notes from the Jesuits that they hated riding in the same boat or in the Attawandaron boats with the Attawandarons because they just absolutely sucked at paddling. This is very interesting. This is actually on the Grand River. This is a village grindstone if you've never seen one. We don't take people there. There's all kinds of artifacts sitting in the ground around this grindstone. But this grindstone's around 4 feet across, and it's about 2.5 feet wide. We actually stumbled across this one day when we were hiking along the Grand. Some bits and pieces of neutral history that there's a lot that I have, but I just want to put some stuff together. So in 1615, Etienne Brule actually escapes from the Iroquois and seeks refuge, and the Attawandarons or neutrals end up protecting him. Then in 1626, we see our first Jesuit priest actually comes among the Attawandarons to record the language, to create conversion, and also looking to establish fur trade. And this creates huge problems. The reason is that the Hurons are the direct traders with the French. And if the French priests are trading directly with the neutrals, then they lose their go-between position. So the Hurons deliberately spread rumors that the Black priest, Dalian, was demonic, had all kinds of black evil skills. This was so effective that the Hurons had to escort Dalian back out of the neutral villages to keep him alive. So, and that actually totally stopped the access of the French to trading directly with the Attawandarons. Then around 1629, we actually see a population census. They say that the neutral population is actually larger than the entire Huron and Six Nations combined. Another one says they were larger than the Petchen, the Erie, the Anadistae combined as well. So very significant population, very significant control. Around 1630, we see smallpox and cholera come in, definitely due to contact with European contract. And that really rolls into epidemic stages more around 1638. Then in Ontario in 1639, there is a huge drought in southern Ontario. Crops are devastated. It is so bad in southern Ontario section where the Attawandarons are that they end up selling their children to the Huron for corn. I found that fascinating. And then in 1640, Father Braybrooke, which everybody's often heard of, ends up showing up on the scene, recording more of the dialect and working with them, and actually creates a very good relationship, not the best, but a good relationship. What's interesting is I think there's only 3 known recorded words from the Attawandaron, and one of those words is actually the word Niagara, which means nape of the neck among the Attawandarons. Also in that same year, there is a severe blizzard, and 60 traveling neutrals were actually found froze in a snowstorm. In 1653, we see a meeting of about 800 neutrals and 1,200 Petchen with the Algonquin Nation up near the Sioux. And then in 1690, we actually see many of these nations have become so decimated that they've almost become one bloodline, and they become what's called the Wyandot, which is a name we've often associated with Huron, but a lot of people don't realize it also means Petchen, Windrow, and the neutrals as well. And then in 1780, John Kinjokedy is actually one of the last known recorded full-blooded neutrals. He was a captive among the Seneca. He was considered a man of great influence and great character among the Senecas themselves. So that's just some bits and pieces. There's a lot more. If you want to contact me. I have a number of blogs on the Attawandaron. As I mentioned, Etch and Brill came around 1650, but I want to talk about something. Champlain fascinates me. Champlain took a large group of young men and he sent them out as emissaries to all the different First Nations. And his goal was to learn about their cultures, learn about their languages. And what he wanted to do was take the best of the indigenous cultures and the best of the French cultures and combine them together to create a better North America. Totally different from the English, whose real goal was that they were the superior people and everything else was to divide and conquer. So the French, their attitude and their emissary position was absolutely amazing. As you say, the neutrals were not neutral. They were actually what I call the police. They enforced neutrality. When Champlain came across a neutral nation, for a peaceful nation, they were actually at war at that time against 17 other nations. Definitely not a docile nation as they go. I want to talk a little bit about torture and captivity. To fall into the hands of the Attawandaron was death, regardless of whether you're a man, a woman, or a child. In fact, they are one of the very few nations that did not take women and children as prisoners. They actually tortured and killed everyone. Often people have interpreted that when torturing is done, it's done as a form of entertainment. Torturing was done for a totally different purpose among the First Nations. It was done as an expression of grief. So if my nation went out and fought against the Hurons, and the Hurons killed a couple of my sons, we would do a raiding party, capture some Hurons, bring them back, and I would express the grief of the loss of my sons on the bodies of those Huron warriors that we had captured, or people. Another thing that was quite common among many of the Iroquoians was what's called spiritual cannibalism. They believed that by eating a superior warrior, they would actually gain the attributes of that warrior. So that's why cannibalism was practiced. It wasn't because they liked eating human flesh. They believed that by taking part of that person and placing it within them physically, they would obtain the attributes of that person. I do want to talk about one thing I came across was about the Mascoutin. Mascoutin are actually part of the Sioux Nation. They were larger than all of the Iroquois nations combined. Huge number of people. Anyways, the neutrals or Attawandarons took a warrior force of 2,000 men, attacked a village of roughly 2,000. They ate about 50 to 80 of their key warriors. They brought back 800 to torture, and they left 1,200 there. The 1,200 that they could not take with them, they put knives in their mouths and sliced it from the end of your mouth up to your cheekbone on both sides, making the mouth into a flap. And then they cut everybody's eyes out and left 1,200 people blind and unable to see and eat, and left them and walked away. Let's talk a little bit about village torture scenarios. Often people were tied onto stakes and they were stripped totally naked, and they would have fires, and the women and children would have pokers in the fire, and their goal was that they could touch your body with these hot sticks wherever they like, but they could not kill you. And the same with hot rocks. They would take hot rocks out of the fire, press them onto your feet or press them into your skin. Another thing they would often do is take white pine pitch, heat it up, and pour it on your head. And what it does is it kind of melts the hair off, but it keeps you alive. They would also cut you open. One of the things they would do is very typical is pull your fingernails and toenails out. The worst thing I came across is these little hooks they made where they would slit your wrist, hook it around a tendon, and yank it out. The tortures went on for 2 to 3 days, and then finally you were wrapped in birch bark and set on fire. So that was how that went. The Attawandarons are very interesting people. Their problem was they could not get muskets. To the north of them, their alliance, the Hurons, were trading directly with the French. Often the Hurons could achieve muskets because if they converted to the Roman Catholic faith, they would be trusted and given a musket. The Hurons did not have a lot of muskets. The difference was among the 6 nations, or at that time was the 5 nations. They were trading directly with the Dutch and the English, and there were no conditions. They understood that beaver pelts meant muskets. Muskets meant power to take over more area, to trap more beaver, get bigger, and away the cycle went. So what we're going to step into next is what we're going to call the Beaver Wars, which was the complete downfall of many of the Iroquois nations in southern Ontario. So what happens, you can see the red circle area, which is the neutrals. And as we've said, the neutrals have this amazing alliance around. So they have the Petchin, the Huron, the Windrow, the Erie, the Squamish, actually surrounding the Iroquois in a way. What the Iroquois do is they understand that if they're going to take over this territory, they have to dismantle the alliance. So the first thing we see is they attack the Windrow. The Windrow flee to the neutral for help. The neutral do nothing, and the Windrow end up living among the neutral or fleeing to the Huron. Then in a couple of years, the Iroquois move around the Huron or around the neutral, go north, and they take out the 4 nations of the Hurons. And the Hurons that survive retreat to neutral land for support. The neutrals again actually hand over the Huron refugees to the Iroquois. Then the next year, we see the Iroquois come back again. And these are winter campaigns. You need to understand winter campaigns are unheard of at that time. That's not when they were normally conducted. They come back, they take out the Tetchin, which are behind the neutrals there on the Bruce Peninsula, and then they retreat. Now what's happened is the 3 alliances, the critical alliances, the Windrow, the Huron, the Petchin have been removed. The Erie are too far away because they're on the other side of Lake Erie, and the Susquehannock or the Andaste are too far away as well. And then we see them attack directly on the neutral nation. In that entire nation, they hit a couple of key villages where there's roughly 2,000 people in each village, and they just decimate the neutrals. The rest of the neutral population actually flees over to the tip of the Lake Michigan area, and that's where the remaining Huron, Petron, and Windrow are staying. The Erie and the Anadaste are still in position at that time, but untouched by the Iroquois. So this kind of gives you an idea of how southern Ontario fell apart. So the Windrow, located at the on the other side of Niagara Falls, between the Genesee River and Niagara River, they fell in 1639. Okay, and then there's kind of a lapse. And then 1649, we see the winter campaign where the Hurons are decimated. Then in 1650, they come back, the Petchin are removed. Then the final attack, 1652, the fall of the neutrals. And then you can see some more dates there when the Erie fell apart. And then finally in 1675, the Anadaste are removed. What ends up happening is that the neutral land ended up becoming Seneca territory. It was actually an extension of what we call the Western Door. And the large Seneca towns were actually at the mouth of the Niagara River on Lake Ontario. And they operated there quite significantly until 1680. And then we have another change. And this is one I really can't explain. The Anishinaabe were actually a very nomadic people. Somehow this variety of small bands comes together, creates a significant warrior force, and they actually push the Seneca or the Haudenosaunee totally out of Ontario for the next 100 years. Then in 1780, we see England negotiating with the Mississauga, which are now in charge of what we call the Grand River Territory, for to get new lands for the Haudenosaunee, or what we would know as the Six Nations. So this is the new territory for the Six Nations. What's interesting is there was actually 950,000 acres in this territory. That's what it's supposed to be. The Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee actually only got 750 of it. The top 300,000 or 200,000 were totally missed. Not missed, they were not given. And you actually see there's a petition where the Haudenosaunee go to the English and say, hey, you promised us the entire grant, what about the top? And the English reply is basically, you've got, we have no money to negotiate and get the rest. So in 1784, America gets its independence, the Six Nations, most of them, 4 of them actually, which were the Mohawk, Cayuga, and Onondaga, sided with the British. The Seneca tried to remain neutral, but actually ended up siding with the British as well. The Oneida and Tuscarora actually sided with the Americans. So they come to the new homeland. They like the Grand River Valley because it's very similar to the Finger Lakes. And as you can see there, they got 750 acres. What a lot of people don't know is that there was a fracturing among the Six Nations. A chief named Deseronto, he was Mohawk, had absolutely no use for Joseph Brant. You also need to understand that Joseph Brant was not a Mohawk chief. He was simply a man very skilled at negotiations between the British in the Haudenosaunee Nation. So Deseronto, basically politely put, hates Joseph Brant, refuses to come into the Grand River Valley, and stays in the Bay of Quinte area. And that's why you have that population in that area near Deseronto. The rest of them actually come to the Six Nations. And what Joseph Brant ends up doing, along with what we call the British Indian agents, is illegally selling off land to European settlers without the consent of the Confederacy. And today there's roughly 50,000 acres left. What is interesting is that a lot of the land that Joseph Brant sold off was put in a trust fund for the Haudenosaunee Nation. And when the Welland Canal was built, it was canal frenzy in the area. You need to understand the roads in the area were so bad that people were looking for waterways to move traffic down. And so they wanted to build a canal system all the way up the Grand River to Cambridge area. There was no money available. The British government didn't have the money, and neither did I'm talking about the British government of Canada. And so they illegally took the funds and used that to purchase and build the Grand River Canal system all the way up the Grand River. So again, it was money illegally taken, and a traveling system was built without the consent of the Confederacy chiefs. What's interesting is that around 1870, the whole canal system goes belly up with the steamships, and it's sold for $1 in the Brantford area here. Okay, with the new lands also comes new rules, and I want to talk a little bit about the residential schools. The idea was to take the First Nations of the area and make them English. Children were normally taken around the ages of 5 and kept till they're about 15 years of age. They're often allowed to go home during the summer. Some never went home. They stayed there at the residential schools year round. Sorry, I'm just going to look at my notes. One of the key things is none of the kids had names. They all had numbers. They were called by those numbers for the next 10 years. Male and female could not talk to each other. Brothers and sisters meant they could not talk to each other. They could not speak their native language. Food was of a very low grade, and often hear them talking about getting fed porridge 3 times a day. And that's why this place we're looking at was called the mush hole. They worked for free, and they were doing all the laboring and maintaining of the farms, but they never reaped any of the benefits. I think one of the other things to understand is that to get extra food, often these children were forced to perform sexual favors for the priests and nuns in that area. And as you know, there was rape in the laundromats and other things went on like that. The main thing was these children were never loved, they were never hugged, they were never kissed. They didn't get that in this environment. And that actually has a huge impact on who they're going to become in the future. I like to call this the Canadian Auschwitz. This was just a place of devastation, all these places that existed. Sorry about the slide here. This was something that talking to many of the survivors when they were children, this is what they were asking themselves when they were put in these kind of conditions. What did I do wrong? As a child, they couldn't fathom why they were taken away from the parents. They couldn't fathom why they were being treated like this. They couldn't fathom why they weren't being allowed to eat. Just the whole situation did not make sense. And I love this line, what did I do wrong, coming from a child. It says everything. I want to share with you 2 stories. One story is actually, I think it was about 3 boys. They were down in the Oneida Nation below London, Ontario. These boys were walking along the road, and a big car pulled up beside them and had friendly conversation with them. And actually, they built up a relationship talking with the children and asked the kids if they'd like to go just up the road for an ice cream cone. So the kids felt safe, hopped in the car, went up the road. The car pulled into the store, bought the ice cream, and then the car turned around. And when the car pulled out of the store, instead of turning back to the Oneida Nation reservation, it turned the other way and took these children to the Mohawk Institute in Brantford. Can you imagine as parents, all of a sudden, your children are gone, you don't know where they are, and here they are in the residential school in Brantford. Horrendous. Just can't even fathom that happening to me and my own family. Another story that I'd like to share, because a lot of people don't hear this side, I know of a survivor who did very well academically, and she was working in the laundromat, and she planned an escape with two Cree women, or Cree girls at that time. So what they did was they secretly set aside clothing, and then they used to do roll call. I don't know whether it was every 2 hours or what it was. After roll call, they immediately left, went into the cornfield, stripped off their orange jumper outfits. This is in the 1960s. And then they changed into the clothes they had stashed, and they followed the Grand River down to the Six Nations reservation. The two Cree girls actually continued back to their reservations, but the Six Nations girl found life so rough at home that she actually thought she was better off at the residential school and went back to the residential school for safety. So that's just one of the few stories that you don't hear. The good news is this one. This is one thing I love. It's called Two Roll on the Grand. It's a spin-off from a paddle on the Hudson River, which celebrated 200 years of alliance between the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee people. So if you look over on the emblem on your left-hand side, you'll see the two purple lines. That's the wampum belt. And it represented the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee traveling side by side, but not interfering with one another. So the Two Roll on the Hudson has been actually brought up to the Grand River. And now it's a 9-day paddle down the Grand. It goes from Cambridge to Lake Erie. It's about 100 kilometers in length. You get to camp along the way. There's food supplied. They move all your gear for you. Then you get to do these unique evening cultural experiences. And the whole concept behind this is to create a paddle of healing and also a paddle that will repolish the chain of friendship between the Allies and the First Nation. So this has been in operation. I think this is the 5th year. It normally operates in July. Last year, because of COVID, they did it in 1-day segments. But if you're very interested, knock on the door of Two Roll on the Grand. This is just a fascinating educational experience. I'm going to kind of share some stories about my own family and my own background. A lot of people ask me if I'm Indigenous, and the answer is no. And so this is where I came from. My family were Germans. In Germany in 1709, it was called the Great Freeze. Something happened. There was huge temperature changes. The Rhine River, for the first time, actually froze solid. The vineyards were destroyed. The orchards were destroyed. The wheat crops, the livestock, everything basically died. So my family ended up fleeing Germany, going down the Rhine River, coming to England, hopping on a ship, and sailing to New York, arriving there in 1710. We actually sold ourselves into servanthood. We were employed in what's called the White Pine pitch camps to make pitch for the British naval. The problem was the project was a huge failure. The White Pines didn't yield the pitch they were expecting. And what happened is they just actually left the families. And so our family ended up moving north, and the Mohawk Nation actually helped us out. We lived in New York State for a while. And then from there, we returned back to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania became quite established farmers. And then our family left Pennsylvania and arrived in Hamilton in 1805, sorry. And then in 1854, they came to the Grand River area. The family that's circled in red is for a specific reason. This guy here, he was my great-great-grandfather, hired Tom Longboat to work for him. And this is a story a lot of people don't know about. So Tom Longboat came and worked. Our farm was where Whiteman's Creek flows into the Grand River. It's called Five Oaks. And Tom was our hired hand working on that farm. He came there in 1906. And this is where Tom trained for the Boston Marathon. He would run from here to Brantford and back each night. My great uncles talk about trying to run with Tom, could not keep up with this man. And as you know, I think it's 1907, he set the fastest time for the Boston Marathon before they changed the course. So that's a little history in our own backyard that most people don't know about. I want to share with you some of my eagle stories. So we have an outdoor education business. We do about 2,000 students a day. And I was looking for a guest speaker that was a medicine man. You need to understand that because I am white, the medicine man society almost is invisible. They don't talk to you. And so one of my friends gave me a contact. So I called up this guy, and this guy said, I would love to meet with you. So he came down to the Grand River Valley. We hiked the Grand River Valley hiking trail, and we just taught each other for about 2 hours and just shared knowledge. And when we were done, I turned to this medicine man and said, why I want to meet with you is I really would like to have you come on staff as a guest speaker with us. We make no commissions. The school knocks on our door. We contact you. You go in. You do your thing, and that's how it works. And the medicine man says to me, "Well, I don't know." And he laughed. And I go, "Oh no." 3 days later, I get an email, and the email says, "As a result of the Eagle clan visiting us that day, you're the person we're supposed to be doing business with." I'm going, "What the heck?" So I called him up and said, "What are you talking about, the Eagle clan?" He said, "Well, Garth," he said, "when you were standing on the point teaching me," he says, "there was 2 bald eagles circling over you, and that is a sure sign that you're the person we're supposed to work with." So that's how I got my medicine man. And I jokingly said to him, "I'm going to tie a bald eagle in the tree every time I meet with you guys from this time on." So that's my bald eagle in the tree picture. This is another interesting story, and it's the eagle story. So one of the programs we used to do, we would bring in medicine men, and they would build a sweat lodge, and this was, they would do a sweat, okay? This is a 3-day program that we were doing at that time. And while we were doing the program, one of the teacher's grandfathers died that night, and her cell phone had died, so they couldn't get hold of her. So they ended up, school contacting me, asking me if I'd go in and tell the teacher. So I told the teacher, and the medicine man was standing there, and he says, "Well, Garth, if you don't mind," he said to the teacher, "I wouldn't mind performing the ceremony of the dead for your grandfather." And what they believe basically is that the spirit comes from the east and needs to be directed out the west. So I was invited to stay, and he performed this ceremony. No sooner is this man done the ceremony than my phone starts vibrating in my pocket. So I step out of the building. I step out of the building onto the north side, and I'm standing there with my head looking up, taking the call. And if a bald eagle does not come flying out of the east, actually flew right down all the way across the roof peak and then out the west. And I just thought that was absolutely amazing. So when I walked in back into the meeting room, I said to the teacher, "Have I got a gift for you?" This is one of my favorite stories. So in the Grand River Valley, there is a creek called White Man's Creek. And I'm going to tell you the story of how it got its name. The Cayuga Nation was actually the main one settled along White Man's Creek in the Grand River area. This was their territory after they inherited the new lands. The Cayuga at that time were also conducting raids into the United States, kidnapping children and bringing them back into Ontario. They actually brought 2 children back into the White Man's Creek area. One was a boy. His name was Thomas Kemp. He was German. They kidnapped him because he had white hair, blue eyes, and they were just fascinated by that. Thomas Kemp ends up growing up among the Cayuga, but falls in the creek, hitting his head and drowning, thus the name White Man's Creek. The other woman, her name is Sarah Jameson. And Sarah actually stays with the Cayuga, comes married within that, raises her family. And that is where the Jameson family came from, Jameson Hill family. So now I'm going to step back into present time. It'd be about 5 or 6 years ago. There was a Cayuga clan mother down in the California, Utah area, writing a book of her family in the White Man's Creek area. Didn't know who to contact for history here. So she called up a cousin in Ottawa. Cousin in Ottawa had absolutely no idea. That night, when the cousin went to bed, her great-great-grandmother, whose name was Catherine Jameson Hill, that's who this picture is, comes to her in a dream and tells her to go find the rafting man. The woman has no idea what that means. Gets up in the morning, Googles rafting man, Grand River. My name comes up first, and I actually had all the information they were looking for. So this woman down in the Utah area comes up to see me. She's actually came up to see me twice to interview me. And the second time she was here, I said to her, "Well, I assume you found this on the web." She turns to me and says, "No, didn't we tell you? We found you in a dream." So that's the story behind that one. I'm going to jokingly tell, I have a nickname. I actually got it. Oh, I'll tell you how I got it. The Namarin Friendship Center down in London has a school for Native youth at risk high school. And I was contacted by them to come down and help them set up an outdoor education program, teaching hunting, canoeing, fishing, kayaking, fish and wildlife identification, edible medicinal plants, the stars, all of that stuff. So we went down there, met with them, talked to them for about an hour. I'm putting on my coat to leave, and they turned to me and said, "Would you teach the course?" I looked at them and said, "I'm white." And that gave me the name, the White Indian. So I'm not an Indian, but I am white. And so that's how that all came about. So I've been working with the First Nations and Friendship Centers, Six Nations in Mississauga, probably for the last good 10 years almost, and really, really enjoy the challenge. Our business has been shifting, and we've now set up a outdoor education company called GROW, which stands for Grand River Outdoor Wilderness Education. And I got programs written in there. And anyways, that's where we're doing the hiking classrooms. You get to programs where you get to dance with the First Nations, sing with the First Nations, medicine men, drumming, just a flint napping. We have flint nappers. So it's just a very unique system. So if you're interested, you can contact me through Grand River Rafting or contact through GROW. One of the things I want to give credit here for, I spent a lot of time in my winters doing my Indigenous research, because a lot of people ask me where I got this stuff from. There is an absolutely amazing library at the Mohawk Institute in Brantford. And with COVID right now, I don't know if it's available. It's probably closed. But if you're looking at doing research, that is the place to go. I consider it the best of the best. And that's where I was able to assemble a lot of these information and writing and stuff that I'm sharing with you. So that's basically what I've got to say today. I'm going to take my screen down, and I will be open for questions.
Okay, if anyone has any questions for Garth, you put it in the Q&A. We have one here. So I'll read it to you, Garth. What are your thoughts on Jean Chrétien recently announcing that he had no knowledge of what was taking place at a residential school while he was the Minister of Indian Affairs in the late 60s and early 70s?
I really find that hard to believe. The First Nations have been shouting unfairness since the day the residential schools were established to the day they were closed. You know, I want to add something that I forgot to add. That is very important to understand. With these residential schools, those children that came out at the end, so the school, I think, closed around in this area, I think it was 1970. So on my age group were the last ones to come out of that school system. This had a huge impact on their parenting abilities. I made the comment that you weren't loved, hugged, or kissed. So these children that came out at my age ended up raising their kids in a military style. And when you talk to the survivors, they will often tell you that many of their kids are either in jail, on drugs, or dead. And the grandparents my age are raising the children. And we're not talking one or two, a lot. The residential schools had a huge, huge ripping apart of the family structures among the First Nations. And you know, when I was invited down to Attawandaron Friendship Center to work, this was really interesting. I found that the kids there had very low self-esteem. And what I quickly realized, what was more important than sharing my head knowledge was helping these kids understand who they were, who they could be, and helping them go somewhere in life. That was that was far more critical than the knowledge I held. Just enjoyed working with them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Garth. Are there any more questions for Garth today?
So I'm going to put one more thing. And if people want to contact me directly, I'm going to give my company email, and you're welcome to do some email tag with me. So it's info, I-N-F-O, at Grand, G-R-A-N-D, River, R-I-V-E-R, then Rafting, R-A-F-T-I-N-G, .ca. So that info at grandriverrafting.ca will put you right on my doorstep. And if you want any insight or any help, you know, it's always free.